It started with a confrontation that never should have happened. She was standing confidently in the lobby of her own workplace, a federal building marked by its towering columns and the air of power that it exuded. Her badge, clipped prominently to her blazer, should have been more than enough to signal that she belonged there. But for him, it wasn't. He had arrived moments earlier, storming into the building on what he claimed was official business. His uniform bore authority, but his eyes betrayed something darker, something that had little to do with the law. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his voice cutting through the quiet efficiency of the space. Heads turned, curious but cautious. She barely flinched. With a steady hand, she pulled her badge forward, holding it out for him to see. He didn't even look at it. "I asked you a question," he snapped, stepping closer, his hand resting on his belt in a gesture that felt more like intimidation than procedure. "People like you don't just wander into places like this without a reason. What are you doing here?" For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that made every second stretch. Her voice, calm and unwavering, finally cut through the tension. "I work here." The laugh that followed was bitter, sharp and loud enough to echo against the marble walls. "Work here? Sure you do. Let me guess, cleaning staff. Maintenance? Maybe you're delivering something. Let me see some real ID, not this, whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at her badge as though it were worthless, his disdain dripping from every word. Her calm demeanor cracked slightly, her brow furrowing, but she remained composed. "That badge grants me access to every floor of this building. It identifies me as..." "Enough," he interrupted, stepping even closer now, his posture threatening. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm not buying it. You need to leave. Now." She stared at him, a storm brewing behind her eyes. The insult, the assumption, the sheer audacity, it burned like fire in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak again, but he didn't give her the chance. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a force that made her stagger. The entire room froze. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, but no one moved to intervene. "You're resisting now," he growled, pulling her toward the door. "Let's take this outside. I don't need your kind causing a scene here." It wasn't just his words that stung. It was the weight of them, the history behind them, the years of prejudice and assumptions condensed into one venomous encounter. Her anger boiled over, but before she could respond, he pushed her through the glass doors and onto the street, the humiliation tangible in every step. "I'll be filing a report on this," she managed, her voice shaking slightly, though not from fear. From fury. "You have no idea what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," he said, leaning in close, his smirk cold and condescending. "And I know exactly what you're doing too. Trying to play a role you're not meant for. Good luck with that." He turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers brushed over the badge still clipped to her blazer, and in that moment, she made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was who he had just laid hands on. The badge he dismissed so easily wasn't just any badge. It was a symbol of authority far beyond his own, a mark of power that could change the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And change it would. But how? How would the tables turn for a man so blinded by his own bias? How far would she go to ensure he faced the consequences of his actions? And just how shocking would the fallout be when the truth finally came to light? Stay with us to find out. The answers will leave you speechless. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination of any kind. To our black viewers and all those impacted by racial injustice, we see you, we stand with you, and we commit to telling stories that reflect the strength, resilience, and dignity of those who overcome prejudice. Your voice matters, your story matters. Now, get ready for a powerful and emotional story of justice and triumph. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join our community. Let's dive in. The morning light filtered through the glass-paneled windows of the FBI headquarters, casting long streaks of gold across the polished floors. It was a symbol of order, of justice, and of authority, an institution built on the ideals of fairness and integrity. For Lauren Mitchell, stepping through its doors every day was not just a routine, it was a testament to everything she had fought for. She had climbed her way to the top, breaking barriers that weren't meant to be broken, at least not by someone who looked like her. She was now the director of the Criminal Investigations Division, a role that came with weighty responsibilities and a relentless drive to prove her worth in a world where her presence was often questioned before her work could even be acknowledged. Lauren carried herself with quiet confidence. Her posture was upright, her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her voice commanded attention in every room she entered. Yet beneath the composed exterior, there was a fire, a refusal to let prejudice define her path. She had seen it all, the subtle dismissals, the overt challenges to her authority, the assumptions that her success was an anomaly rather than the result of her relentless dedication. But Lauren had never let it deter her. If anything, it fueled her. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in a world that had underestimated her. Her day started early, as always, with a coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. The agenda was packed, a high-profile case briefing at 10, a meeting with the deputy director at noon, and hours of analysis for an ongoing investigation into organized crime. The work was demanding, but Lauren thrived under pressure. It wasn't just about solving cases, it was about dismantling systems that allowed injustice to flourish. Every case, every lead, every detail was another step toward making the world just a little more equitable. Across town, Officer Brad Simmons was starting his shift. Brad was the kind of cop who liked to think of himself as the law incarnate. His uniform was always pristine, his badge polished to a blinding shine, and his ego even more so. To his colleagues, he was a seasoned officer who got things done. To the communities he patrolled, he was a figure of authority whose presence often brought more tension than security. Brad prided himself on his instincts, which, in his mind, were rarely wrong. But his instincts weren't driven by training or experience, they were driven by assumptions, biases, and a deeply ingrained sense of superiority. Brad had spent years on the force, navigating the gray areas of his authority with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed in control, maintaining it, enforcing it, and ensuring that no one dared to question it. Over time, that belief had morphed into something more dangerous, a conviction that he was untouchable. He didn't see his actions as racially motivated, to him, he was simply doing his job. If people got hurt along the way, that was their problem, not his. The paths of Lauren and Brad were destined to cross in the most unexpected of ways. It began on an ordinary Monday morning, with the usual rhythm of work and responsibility guiding their actions. Lauren arrived at the office early, greeted by the familiar hum of activity in the building. Agents moved briskly through the halls, their conversations laced with urgency. It was a typical day in every sense, except for the storm that was quietly brewing. Meanwhile, Brad was tasked with responding to a report of a suspicious individual near a federal building. He didn't question the validity of the call, he rarely did. His first thought was to assert control, to remind whoever it was that their presence wasn't welcome if they didn't belong. As he drove toward the address, his mind raced with assumptions, each one reinforcing his belief that he was stepping into a situation where his authority would be needed, and unquestioned. Lauren's day had just begun when she decided to step out into the lobby for a moment of fresh air before her first meeting. The weight of her responsibilities was something she carried with pride, but even she needed a breather from time to time. She adjusted her blazer, clipped her badge securely in place, and made her way to the glass doors that opened onto the bustling street outside. It was a brief moment of stillness in an otherwise chaotic day. Brad's car pulled up to the curb just as Lauren stepped out. He spotted her immediately, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. She was composed, professional, and confident, a presence that radiated authority. But to Brad, she was none of those things. To him, she was someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be put in her place. He didn't notice the badge clipped to her blazer. Or maybe he did, and he didn't care. Lauren noticed him too. It was hard not to. The car screeched to a halt, and he stepped out with a swagger that practically screamed confrontation. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized the energy he carried. It was familiar, all too familiar. She braced herself, knowing exactly what was coming. Their encounter began with words, sharp and pointed. Brad questioned her presence, his tone laced with disdain. Lauren responded calmly, trying to diffuse the situation with reason. But reason wasn't what Brad was looking for. As the exchange escalated, he dismissed her badge as meaningless, his assumptions clouding his judgment at every turn. And then he crossed a line, a physical line, grabbing her arm with a force that sent a ripple of shock through the bystanders who had begun to gather. Lauren's reaction was measured, her voice steady even as the humiliation burned within her. She made it clear that his actions were out of line, that he had no authority to treat her this way. But Brad wasn't listening. He was too consumed by his own narrative, too blinded by his own prejudice to see the reality of who he was dealing with. The encounter ended as abruptly as it began, with Lauren standing on the sidewalk, her chest heaving with anger and frustration. Brad walked away, his sense of superiority intact, unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. For Lauren, the moment was more than a personal insult, it was a reminder of the fight she had dedicated her life to. And she wasn't about to let it go. As the hours passed, the ripple effects of their confrontation began to spread. Conversations were had, calls were made, and the wheels of justice started turning. Lauren's position and her resolve ensured that this wouldn't be just another incident swept under the rug. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the fallout from Brad's actions would prove to be far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. The air in the office felt heavier that afternoon. Lauren sat at her desk, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood as she replayed the morning's events in her mind. Every word, every gesture from Officer Brad Simmons lingered, not just as a memory but as a sharp, stinging reminder of the battle she thought she no longer had to fight. She had spent years building her career, earning respect through her relentless dedication, and yet a single encounter had managed to strip her of her dignity in the eyes of a man who refused to see her for who she truly was. But Lauren wasn't one to wallow in the weight of injustice. She was a strategist, a woman who knew that power lay not in immediate reaction but in calculated response. Her assistant, a young and earnest agent named Emily, entered the room cautiously, holding a tablet with a stream of notifications flashing across the screen. Emily had been with Lauren long enough to recognize the expression on her face, a cold, determined calm that signaled something big was brewing. Emily placed the tablet on the desk and spoke softly, careful not to disrupt Lauren's train of thought. "I've pulled up the surveillance footage from the lobby, Director. It's all there. Every second of it." Lauren's eyes flicked to the screen, the tension in her jaw tightening as she watched the recording. There it was, the moment when Brad's hand gripped her arm, his words dripping with disdain, his posture exuding unchecked arrogance. She paused the video and leaned back in her chair, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She needed to act, but how? This wasn't just about her, it was about the culture that allowed people like Brad Simmons to operate without accountability. "Thank you, Emily," Lauren finally said, her voice steady but tinged with the undercurrent of her resolve. "Send this to the Internal Affairs team. I want a full report on his disciplinary history. And get me the legal department on the line. We're not letting this slide." Emily nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. As she left the room, Lauren turned her attention back to the tablet, her mind focused on the next steps. There was a process for handling situations like this, and Lauren was going to follow it to the letter. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about the system that enabled him, the complacency that allowed his behavior to go unchecked. Meanwhile, Brad Simmons sat in the precinct, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon him. He was in high spirits, recounting the morning's events to a couple of his colleagues. His tone was dismissive, his words laced with an air of triumph as he described how he had put that woman in her place. The others laughed along, their chuckles tinged with discomfort but not enough to challenge him. Brad didn't notice the fleeting glances they exchanged, the way one of them quickly excused himself and disappeared into another room. Later that day, Brad received a call from his captain, summoning him to a meeting. He entered the office with his usual confidence, expecting a routine discussion. But the atmosphere was different. The captain's expression was stern, his tone clipped as he motioned for Brad to take a seat. Brad frowned, his arrogance faltering slightly as he settled into the chair. "There's been a complaint," the captain began, his eyes fixed on Brad. "From someone very high up." Brad scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Let me guess. That woman from this morning? She's probably making a big deal out of nothing. You know how people like that can be." The captain's gaze hardened, and Brad shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. "That woman," the captain said slowly, "is not just anyone. She's the director of the FBI's Criminal Investigations Division. And we have footage of your interaction with her. I've watched it. It's not a good look, Simmons. Not for you, not for this department." For a moment, Brad was silent, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a heavy fog. He opened his mouth to speak, but the captain cut him off. "You've crossed a line, Brad. And you're going to face the consequences." The tension in the room was palpable as Brad processed the captain's words. He had always operated with the belief that he was untouchable, that his badge shielded him from accountability. But now, for the first time, that belief was beginning to crack. Lauren, meanwhile, was making her own moves. She had spent the afternoon gathering every piece of evidence she could find, not just about the morning's encounter but about Brad's entire history. Complaints from citizens, internal reports that had been buried, patterns of behavior that painted a damning picture. It was all there, a trail of misconduct that had gone unchecked for far too long. And Lauren was determined to bring it all to light. By the evening, the story had begun to spread. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations turned into murmurs of outrage. The footage from the lobby, while not yet public, had been shared with key individuals who held influence within the law enforcement community. The weight of Lauren's position and her unwavering resolve ensured that the issue couldn't be ignored. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Brad's world, once so secure and predictable, was beginning to unravel. His colleagues, many of whom had turned a blind eye to his behavior for years, were now distancing themselves. The captain had ordered an internal review, and Brad had been placed on administrative leave. He spent the evening at home, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, fear, and denial. He couldn't understand how things had spiraled so quickly. In his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just doing his job. Wasn't he? Lauren, on the other hand, was just getting started. She knew that the coming days would be crucial, that the actions she took now would set the tone for how this incident would be remembered. It wasn't just about justice, it was about sending a message. A message that no one, no matter their position or their uniform, was above the law. As the night settled over the city, the tension hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Brad's arrogance had carried him this far, but it was clear that his actions had finally caught up with him. And Lauren, with her unwavering resolve and her refusal to back down, was ready to see this through to the end. The stage was set, the players in place, and the stakes higher than ever. But what would happen when the full weight of the truth came crashing down? The answer was coming, and it would leave everyone reeling. The hearing room was quieter than Lauren had expected. The air felt heavy, not with noise but with the weight of anticipation. Rows of chairs lined the walls, filled with men and women in uniform, a few wearing plain suits. At the front of the room, a long table stretched across the space, microphones placed neatly at each seat. The panel of investigators sat behind it, their faces stern but unreadable. Lauren stood near the back, her presence commanding attention despite her decision to remain silent for the moment. She was here to observe, to watch everything unfold. This wasn't her battle to fight directly anymore, she had set the wheels in motion, and now the system would do what it was built to do, or what it was supposed to do. Brad Simmons sat at the center table, his posture rigid and his jaw tight. His uniform was spotless, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, but the confidence he once carried like armor was notably absent. The smirk he had worn so easily was replaced by something that looked almost like doubt. He avoided looking at the panel directly, his eyes darting to the edges of the room, scanning for allies, but finding none. The lead investigator, a man with graying hair and a calm but authoritative voice, leaned forward, clearing his throat. The room stilled further, as though everyone collectively held their breath. "Officer Simmons, this hearing is not a trial. It is, however, a formal inquiry into your actions on the morning of October 14th. You are here to answer for a reported misuse of authority and allegations of misconduct. Do you understand the gravity of the accusations against you?" Brad nodded stiffly, gripping the edge of the table as though it could anchor him. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a defensive edge. "I do, sir. But with all due respect, I was just doing my job. Everything I did that day was within the scope of my authority." The investigator didn't react, his face a practiced mask. He flipped through a file in front of him, his fingers brushing over the papers. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage, Officer Simmons. It tells a different story. You approached a civilian outside a federal building, ignored her identification when it was presented to you, and proceeded to escalate the encounter unnecessarily. This civilian was not only in a space where she had every right to be, but she also held a position that places her far above your own in the chain of command. Why did you dismiss her credentials?" Brad shifted in his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the table harder. I didn't recognize her, sir. She wasn't dressed in a way that looked like she belonged in a place like that." The room seemed to collectively inhale, a subtle but sharp sound that hung in the air. Lauren felt a flicker of anger rise within her, but she remained still, her expression unreadable. The lead investigator, however, let a moment of silence stretch before responding. "Didn't look like she belonged." He repeated the words slowly, as though weighing them carefully. "Explain that, Officer Simmons. What exactly does someone who belongs look like?" Brad hesitated, his confidence crumbling under the scrutiny. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face reddening. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant she didn't have the usual appearance of someone in a position of authority." "So, you assumed," the investigator pressed, his voice never rising but carrying an unmistakable edge. "You assumed that a black woman outside a federal building couldn't possibly hold a position of authority. Is that what you're saying?" Brad's silence was louder than any words could have been. He stared down at the table, his arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame, or perhaps just fear. The investigator didn't let up. "Let me make this clear. The woman you disrespected, the woman whose badge you dismissed, is Director Lauren Mitchell. She oversees one of the most critical divisions in the FBI. And yet you chose to treat her as though she were a criminal, based on nothing but your assumptions. Do you understand the severity of your actions now, Officer Simmons?" Before Brad could respond, another voice cut through the room. It was Lauren. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she approached the table. All eyes turned to her, and the room seemed to hold its breath again. "With all due respect," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything she had held back until now, "I don't think he does understand. Because if he did, he wouldn't be sitting here, still trying to defend himself, still refusing to acknowledge what he did. This isn't just about me. This is about every person he's treated this way, every assumption he's made, every abuse of power he's justified to himself. Brad's head snapped up, his eyes locking on hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, defiance, perhaps, but it quickly faded under her unwavering gaze. She continued, her tone sharp but controlled. You didn't just disrespect me that day, Officer Simmons. You disrespected the badge you wear, the oath you took, and the very principles you claimed to stand for. And I will not allow that to go unanswered. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Brad looked as though he wanted to respond, but no words came. The investigator cleared his throat, breaking the tension slightly. Thank you, Director Mitchell, he said, his tone respectful. Your statement has been noted and will be included in the final report. Lauren gave a curt nod, stepping back and retaking her seat. The hearing continued, but the outcome was already clear. Brad's defenses had crumbled, his excuses exposed for what they were. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the panel's questions only reinforced the gravity of his actions. By the end of the session, it was evident that his career, and perhaps more, was hanging by a thread. As the room emptied, Lauren stood near the exit, watching as Brad walked out, his shoulders slumped and his expression hollow. He avoided her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not arrogance but fear. It wasn't satisfaction she felt in that moment, but something closer to resolve. This was just the beginning. There was still more to be done, more changes to be made, but for now, she had taken a step toward justice. As the sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the precinct, Brad sat in the dim light of the locker room, the air thick with the stale scent of sweat and worn leather. His head was buried in his hands, the weight of the hearing and its implications pressing down on him like a suffocating force. His mind raced, replaying the pointed questions, the damning footage, and the calm but cutting words of Lauren Mitchell. He couldn't shake her voice, the way she had looked at him, unflinching, as though she could see straight through him. The door creaked open, and the sound of measured footsteps echoed through the empty space. Brad didn't look up, but he knew who it was before she spoke. The voice was unmistakable, firm, commanding, and laced with a quiet strength that made every word carry twice its weight. You're still here, Lauren said, her heels clicking softly against the tile as she approached. I thought you'd leave as quickly as you could. Most people do when they're running from accountability. Brad exhaled sharply, finally lifting his head to meet her gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, the bravado he usually carried nowhere to be found. What do you want? Haven't you done enough? Lauren raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms as she leaned against a nearby locker. Done enough? That's an interesting way to frame it. You think this is about me getting some kind of revenge? About me wanting to see you humiliated? Brad's silence spoke volumes. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching and unclenching as he tried to find the right words. Lauren didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped closer, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. This isn't about you, Officer Simmons. And it's not about me, either. It's about the fact that people like you, people who abuse their authority and let their biases dictate their actions, are allowed to operate unchecked. It's about the system that enables you. What happened to me is just a symptom of a much bigger problem, and I refuse to let it go ignored. Brad looked away, his jaw tightening as her words hit their mark. You think you're so perfect, he muttered, his voice low but bitter. You think you've never made a mistake, never judged someone wrong. Lauren's laugh was short and humorless, her expression hardening. Perfect? You think that's what this is about? I've made mistakes, Officer Simmons. Plenty of them. But here's the difference, when I make a mistake, I own it. I don't hide behind a badge or an excuse. I don't dismiss the harm I've caused. And I sure as hell don't blame the people I've hurt for the consequences of my actions. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Brad's hands gripped the bench beneath him, his knuckles white. He finally stood, his posture stiff as he faced her. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt to sound composed. "You've made your point. The whole department's turned on me. My career's over. What more do you want?" Lauren studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but no less firm. "What I want is for you to understand what you've done. Not just to me, but to every person who's been on the other side of your assumptions. I want you to understand that the badge you wear isn't a license to judge, to humiliate, or to harm. It's a responsibility. And if you can't carry that responsibility with integrity, you have no business wearing it." Brad's eyes darted to the floor, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to." He stopped himself, shaking his head as though the words were too difficult to say. Lauren's gaze softened slightly, though her resolve remained unshaken. "You didn't mean to get caught," she said quietly, her words cutting through the silence. "That's the truth, isn't it? You didn't mean to face the consequences. But now you have to. And what you do next will define who you are. Not the badge, not the uniform, your actions." Brad didn't respond, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his emotions. Lauren straightened, stepping back as she prepared to leave. But before she reached the door, she turned back to face him one last time. "Accountability isn't just about punishment," she said, her voice steady. "It's about growth. It's about facing the worst parts of yourself and choosing to be better. That choice is yours, Officer Simmons. No one can make it for you." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels echoing through the empty room. Brad stood frozen, her words reverberating in his mind. For the first time, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions, not just their consequences, but their impact. The silence that followed wasn't just external. It was within him, a void where his certainty used to be. As Lauren stepped out into the cool evening air, she felt a sense of closure, but not satisfaction. This wasn't the end, there was still work to be done, battles to be fought, changes to be made. But for now, she had done what she could. The rest was up to him. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with an energy that wasn't entirely unfamiliar but felt heavier than usual. Conversations were quieter, glances were exchanged but rarely lingered, and the weight of the previous day's hearing seemed to seep into the very walls of the building. For Brad Simmons, the world had shifted. His desk, once a place of certainty and order, now felt like a stage under an unrelenting spotlight. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their usual banter replaced with uneasy silence. He had been suspended, pending a final decision, but was allowed access to clean out his belongings. The symbolic act of packing his things felt like an execution of his identity, and the reality of what lay ahead began to close in. As Brad began to gather his belongings, the silence around him was broken by a familiar voice. It was his captain, a man who had been both a mentor and a source of occasional friction. The captain stood in the doorway, his arms crossed and his face unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and something softer that Brad couldn't quite place. "You've got 5 minutes," the captain said, his voice even but firm. "Then we need to escort you out. You understand how this works?" Brad nodded, his movements slow as he carefully placed his things into a cardboard box. The captain lingered for a moment before stepping into the room, his tone softening slightly. "I need to ask you something. Do you regret it?" Brad paused, his hand hovering over a photo frame that held a picture of his first day on the job. He didn't look up, his voice quiet and uncertain. "I don't know anymore. I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was keeping order, making things right. But now, I don't know." The captain sighed, leaning against the edge of a nearby desk. "You were given authority, Simmons. A badge. A symbol of trust. But authority isn't about control, it's about responsibility. It's about knowing when to act and when to listen. Somewhere along the line, you lost sight of that. Brad's fingers tightened around the photo frame, the weight of the words sinking in. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It's not like anyone's going to forgive me for this. It's not like I can just fix it." The captain's expression softened, his voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. "That's not for me to decide, Simmons. That's on you. You've got to figure out what kind of man you want to be. And you've got to live with the choices you've made. But if you want my advice, start by owning it. Not just to the people in that room yesterday but to yourself." Brad didn't respond, the silence stretching as the captain stood and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The minutes passed slowly, each one filled with the echoes of his own doubts. As he finished packing, he felt a strange emptiness, a sense of loss that he couldn't quite put into words. Meanwhile, across the city, Lauren Mitchell sat in her office, her focus unwavering despite the emotional weight of the past few days. The hearing had been a step forward, but it was only the beginning. The fallout from Brad's actions had sparked a broader conversation within the department, one that Lauren had no intention of letting fade into silence. She was already drafting proposals, organizing meetings, and pushing for systemic changes that went beyond one man's behavior. This wasn't about revenge, it was about transformation. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her train of thought. It was a message from Emily, her assistant, who had been keeping tabs on the aftermath of the hearing. The message was brief but carried significant weight: "Brad Simmons has requested a meeting." Lauren stared at the screen, her mind racing. The request was unexpected, and part of her questioned whether it was worth her time. But another part of her, the part that had spent years fighting for accountability and change, knew that this was an opportunity. She replied with a simple message: "Schedule it." Later that afternoon, Brad arrived at the federal building, his steps hesitant as he approached the entrance. The lobby felt different now, the space that had once been the scene of his greatest mistake now carrying the weight of his shame. He hesitated before stepping inside, the security guards eyeing him with a mix of recognition and disapproval. One of them gestured toward the elevators, and Brad nodded, his throat dry as he made his way to Lauren's office. When he entered, Lauren was already seated behind her desk, her posture as composed as ever. She gestured toward the chair opposite her, her expression unreadable. Brad sat down slowly, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. The silence between them was thick, neither of them willing to speak first. Finally, Lauren broke the silence, her voice calm but firm. "You asked for this meeting. What do you want, Officer Simmons?" Brad winced at the title, knowing it no longer carried the same weight. He swallowed hard, his voice shaky as he began to speak. "I wanted to say. I wanted to apologize. For what I did. For how I treated you. I was wrong, and I see that now. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him carefully. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong? Or are you just sorry because you got caught?" Brad hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze. I think it's both. Getting caught forced me to see it, to really look at myself. And I don't like what I see. I've spent so long thinking I was doing the right thing, that I couldn't see how much harm I was causing. I know I can't undo it, but I want to try to make it right." Lauren's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained measured. "Making it right isn't about apologizing to me, Simmons. It's about changing who you are, how you see the world, how you carry the responsibility that comes with your actions. Words are easy. Change is hard." Brad nodded, his hands gripping the edges of the chair as though it could ground him. "I know. And I'm not asking for anything from you. I just needed to say it. To own it. Lauren studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Then you've taken the first step. But don't think for a second that it ends here. Accountability isn't a moment, it's a process. And it's one you'll have to face every single day. Brad stood, the weight in his chest feeling slightly lighter but still present. As he left the office, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, though what that was remained uncertain. For Lauren, the meeting was a reminder of why she did what she did, not for moments of validation but for the hope that change, however small, was possible. Both of them were left with the understanding that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a journey worth taking. The following days unfolded with a tension that neither Lauren nor Brad could ignore, though each faced it in entirely different ways. Lauren was resolute, as always, diving into the work she knew mattered most. Her office became a hub of movement, agents coming and going, meetings overlapping, and her assistant Emily shuffling between tasks with an urgency that mirrored Lauren's own. The proposals Lauren had drafted for departmental reform were gaining traction, sparking discussions that had once seemed impossible. For every step forward, though, there was resistance. Change, she knew, was never linear, and the fight to overhaul a culture so deeply rooted in bias and complacency would take more than just policies and meetings. It would take vigilance and persistence. And for that, she was prepared. Brad, on the other hand, found himself adrift. The structure of his days, once dictated by shifts and patrols, had dissolved into an expanse of unstructured hours. The suspension left him in limbo, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him with each passing moment. He avoided the precinct, the stares of his colleagues too much to bear, though he couldn't escape the whispers that followed him even outside its walls. The hearing had become the talk of the department, and while some defended him, others openly criticized his actions. Brad couldn't decide which reaction stung more, the loyalty born from shared bias or the condemnation he felt was tinged with hypocrisy. Late one evening, as the city buzzed quietly outside his window, Brad found himself replaying the conversation he'd had with Lauren. Her words lingered, not as accusations but as truths he couldn't ignore. Accountability isn't a moment, it's a process. He'd heard variations of that phrase before, in training seminars and department briefings, but it had never hit him the way it did now. Sitting in the dim light of his apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of a city that no longer felt like home, Brad picked up his phone and began dialing. Lauren was in the middle of reviewing case files when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly at the sight of Brad's name. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in her gut told her to answer. She tapped the screen, her voice steady as she spoke. Simmons. Brad hesitated on the other end, the weight of the call already making him second-guess himself. Director Mitchell, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, Lauren replied, not unkindly but firmly. So unless this is important, I suggest you get to the point. Brad exhaled, the tension in his chest tightening. I've been thinking about what you said. About accountability. About change. I don't know if it means anything coming from me, but I've started looking into ways I can actually do something about this. I've been reaching out to community leaders, trying to understand where I went wrong, not just that day, but all the days before it. Lauren leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly though her tone remained measured. And what have you learned so far? Brad's voice wavered slightly as he responded, the vulnerability in his words evident. That I've been blind. That I let my assumptions guide me instead of facts. That I've hurt people in ways I didn't even realize, and some I'll never be able to make right. I'm not looking for sympathy, but I want to do better. I need to. There was a long pause on Lauren's end, the silence stretching between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter but no less firm. It's not about wanting to do better, Simmons. It's about actually doing it. Words are easy. Actions are what matter. I know, Brad said quickly, his desperation bleeding through. I know, and that's why I'm calling. I want to be part of the solution, but I don't know where to start. You've been in this fight for years. Maybe you could. Lauren cut him off, her tone sharpening slightly. No. This isn't my fight to hand to you, Simmons. This is your mess to clean up. You don't get to lean on me for guidance after everything that's happened. If you want to fix what you've broken, you start by taking responsibility, by putting in the work, not because someone told you to but because it's the right thing to do. Brad was silent for a moment, her words hitting harder than he expected. You're right, he said finally, his voice quieter. I needed to say it out loud. To someone who understands. Lauren sighed, the exhaustion in her voice undeniable. Understanding doesn't mean excusing, Simmons. And it doesn't mean I'm going to hold your hand through this. But if you're serious, if you're truly serious, then start by listening. Go to the people you've dismissed, the communities you've hurt, and listen. Not to defend yourself, not to explain, but to understand. And don't expect forgiveness. You're not owed that. The weight of her words settled over him, the finality in her tone leaving no room for argument. Thank you, Brad said after a long pause. For answering the call. And for being honest. Honesty is the least of what you deserve, Lauren replied, her voice colder now. Good night, Simmons. She hung up before he could respond, the sound of the call ending echoing in the silence of his apartment. Brad set the phone down, his thoughts swirling. Her words weren't comforting, but they weren't supposed to be. They were a challenge, a call to action, and for the first time in his career, he felt the weight of what that truly meant. For Lauren, the conversation was another reminder of how far the journey toward justice stretched. It wasn't about a single man or a single incident, it was about dismantling a system that allowed men like Brad Simmons to thrive. And while she had no intention of softening her stance, there was a small part of her that hoped he would take the path she had laid out, not for her sake but for the sake of everyone who had been on the receiving end of his failures. As the city settled into the quiet of the night, both of them found themselves staring into the same darkness, their paths now intertwined not by choice but by consequence. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and unspoken fears. But it was a road they would both have to walk, each carrying the weight of their own accountability, each searching for a way to move forward without erasing the past. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy stillness, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Brad found himself in unfamiliar territory, navigating a world stripped of the authority and identity he had clung to for so long. He had started reaching out to community leaders, attending meetings where he was met with everything from cautious curiosity to open hostility. Each interaction felt like stepping into a fire, his presence a reminder of wounds that had yet to heal. Yet, for the first time, Brad wasn't running from the discomfort. He was leaning into it, letting the words of those he had wronged settle deeply, even when they stung. One such meeting was held in the basement of a community center, its walls lined with faded posters advocating for justice and equality. Brad entered the room with trepidation, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as though trying to hide the nervous energy radiating from him. A small group of people sat in a circle, their faces a mix of weariness and guarded determination. The leader of the group, an older man named Joseph, gestured for Brad to take a seat. His gaze was steady, his tone measured as he spoke. Thank you for coming, Joseph began, though his expression betrayed no warmth. But let me be clear, this isn't about making you feel better. This is about accountability. You're here to listen, not to justify or defend. Brad nodded, his throat dry as he tried to find the right words. I understand. I'm not here to make excuses. I need to hear it. I need to know what I've done, from the people who've lived it. A young woman sitting across from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Do you really? Or are you just here because you got caught and you're trying to save face? The question hung in the air, the tension palpable. Brad met her gaze, his voice quieter now but no less sincere. I'm here because I've realized that I was wrong. Not just about that one day, but about so many things. And I know that just saying I'm sorry doesn't mean anything. That's why I'm here, to learn, to understand, and to figure out how to do better. Joseph raised a hand, signaling for calm as he turned his attention back to Brad. Words are a start, but they're not enough. You've got a lot of work to do, Simmons. And it's not going to be easy. People aren't going to trust you right away. Some might never trust you. But if you're serious about this, you need to be prepared for that. Brad nodded again, the weight of Joseph's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. The rest of the meeting unfolded in a series of stories, each one a window into lives shaped by the kind of prejudice and abuse Brad had perpetuated, knowingly or not. He sat in silence, absorbing every word, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and determination. By the time the meeting ended, he felt raw, as though layers of his own ignorance had been peeled back to reveal a vulnerability he wasn't sure how to handle. Meanwhile, Lauren was dealing with her own battles. The fallout from the hearing had sparked a wave of both support and resistance within the FBI. Some applauded her courage and commitment to accountability, while others questioned her motives, accusing her of bringing unnecessary scrutiny to the department. She had grown accustomed to such criticism, but it didn't make it any less exhausting. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Emily entered with a stack of papers and a concerned expression. "Director, there's something you should see," Emily said, placing the papers on Lauren's desk. "It's a report on disciplinary actions within the precinct where Simmons worked. There's a pattern here, complaints that were filed but never acted on, incidents that were swept under the rug." Lauren scanned the documents, her brow furrowing as the extent of the negligence became clear. This wasn't just about Brad Simmons, it was about a culture that had allowed him to thrive. She looked up at Emily, her jaw tightening. "We need to bring this to the deputy director. If we don't address this, it'll keep happening." Emily hesitated, her voice quieter now. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pushback? You've already got people questioning your decisions. This could make things even harder." Lauren straightened, her resolve unshaken. "If we don't push, nothing changes. And I didn't take this job to maintain the status quo. Schedule a meeting. I want this in front of the deputy director by the end of the week." As the days passed, Brad continued attending meetings and seeking out conversations that forced him to confront the realities he had long ignored. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, he found himself standing outside the precinct, staring up at the building that had once felt like home. He hesitated before walking inside, the familiar corridors now tinged with a sense of alienation. He approached the captain's office, knocking lightly before stepping in. The captain looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Simmons. Didn't expect to see you here. What can I do for you?" Brad took a deep breath, his hands clenching at his sides. "I wanted to talk. About the complaints that were filed against me. The ones that never went anywhere." The captain leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharpening. "You're opening a can of worms, Simmons. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Brad nodded, his voice steady. "I have to be. I need to take responsibility for what I've done, and that starts with acknowledging the damage I've caused. If there are people I need to apologize to, people I need to face, I want to do it." The captain studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "All right. But you'd better be ready for what you're about to uncover. This isn't just about you, Simmons. It's about a system that's failed a lot of people. And if you're serious about this, you're going to have to face more than just your own mistakes." Brad left the office feeling both heavier and lighter, the enormity of the task ahead clear but his path finally beginning to take shape. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving towards something real, something meaningful. Lauren, meanwhile, continued to fight her own battles, her determination unwavering even as the resistance grew. She knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew that change was possible. It was happening, slowly but surely, and she was determined to see it through. Both she and Brad were on journeys that were far from over, their paths intertwined in ways neither of them could have anticipated. And as the days turned into weeks, the ripples of their actions began to spread, setting the stage for a future that was still uncertain but filled with the possibility of redemption, accountability, and transformation. Months had passed, and the echoes of that pivotal hearing had spread far beyond the walls of the precinct or the corridors of the FBI. The city was no longer the same, not because it had changed overnight but because something deeper had shifted. The aftermath of Brad's actions and Lauren's relentless pursuit of accountability had ignited conversations in places where silence had long been the norm. For both of them, life had taken turns they hadn't fully anticipated. Brad sat quietly in a modest community center, surrounded by a group of teenagers whose faces reflected a mix of skepticism and curiosity. It was his third time volunteering as part of a local program aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. He had been invited, not because he was an ideal example, but because he represented what could happen when accountability was forced into the light. The young woman who had confronted him at that first meeting months ago, Maya, stood beside him, her presence a clear signal that she was there to hold him accountable. Brad cleared his throat, the room falling silent as the teenagers waited for him to speak. "I used to wear a badge," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "And for a long time, I thought that badge made me better than the people I was supposed to serve. I was wrong. That badge wasn't about power. It was about trust. And I broke that trust, over and over again." The room was still, the weight of his words settling over the group. Maya stepped forward, her tone firm but not unkind. "What he's saying isn't just about his story. It's about what happens when we stop holding people accountable, when we let assumptions and prejudice go unchecked. This isn't about pity for him, it's about making sure no one else has to experience what so many of us have." Brad nodded, his voice quiet but resolute as he added, "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I have to earn back the trust one lost, even if it takes the rest of my life. And I'm here because I want to listen, to understand, and to be part of something better." Meanwhile, Lauren was standing in front of a crowded room at FBI headquarters, the audience a mix of agents, community leaders, and journalists. She had spent months working tirelessly to implement reforms, many of which were met with resistance, but the momentum she had built was undeniable. The department had begun adopting new protocols for addressing complaints, increasing transparency, and providing mandatory bias training for all officers. Lauren's unwavering commitment had turned her into a national figure, a symbol of what accountability could look like when pursued with integrity. As she spoke, her voice carried a quiet but powerful authority. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about rebuilding trust. It's about creating a culture where accountability isn't feared but embraced, where authority is used to protect, not to harm. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance. But it starts here, with all of us." The room erupted into applause, but Lauren didn't bask in it. Her focus remained on the work that still needed to be done. After the event, as she walked through the bustling hallways of the FBI, she felt a rare moment of pride. Not for herself, but for the progress she had seen, for the conversations that were finally happening, and for the lives that would be better because of it. Later that evening, Lauren received an unexpected message from Maya. It was a photo of Brad standing with the teenagers at the community center, a caption reading, "People can change. Sometimes, they just need to be forced to face themselves first." Lauren stared at the image for a long moment, a small smile playing at her lips. She didn't know what the future held for Brad, but for the first time, she believed he was on the right path. For Brad, the journey was far from over. He had left law enforcement for good, knowing that returning to the badge wasn't the right path for him. Instead, he focused on repairing the relationships he had damaged and advocating for changes within the system he had once served. It was a slow process, often thankless, but it was one he knew he had to see through. The man who once saw himself as untouchable now understood the weight of responsibility and the necessity of humility. Lauren's career continued to soar, but she remained grounded in the mission that had driven her from the start. She knew that change was fragile and that it required constant vigilance. But she also knew that it was possible, and that knowledge fueled her every day. Her story, and Brad's, became part of a larger narrative, a reminder that accountability, while painful, could lead to transformation. Reflecting on this journey, we're left with questions that resonate far beyond this story. How often do we stop to question the systems we trust to protect us? How do we hold power accountable without losing sight of our shared humanity? And perhaps most importantly, what role do we play in ensuring that change is not just a possibility but a reality? At Tales of Twist, we tell stories that challenge us to think, to feel, and to reflect. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this journey resonated with you the most? How do you think we can all contribute to a more just and equitable world? Let us know, we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Stories like this are only the beginning. Together, we can uncover truths, challenge assumptions, and inspire change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.